morning, everybody. Welcome to Halifax. Those of you who are not from Halifax, we'll should see some sunshine later today to rid of this fog. But thanks for the opportunity. I'm really excited to be part of this panel. So I'm going to talk about a public health approach to cannabis regulation. I'm going to start with a little bit of the epidemiology of cannabis use in Canada. So this slide shows the large bars, the slightly darker blue, are any reported lifetime use of cannabis. And on average, about a third of Canadians report that they use cannabis at any time in their life. And Nova Scotia has the dubious distinction of having the highest reported rates of almost 43% of lifetime use. The smaller bars are past year use, and the average Canadian average is about 10.5%, with the highest rates of past year self-reported use of cannabis in BC of 13%, and followed by Nova Scotia at 12.5%. This is self-report, and you know from self-report on any lifestyle behavior, whether it's nutrition, alcohol intake, cannabis use, there's a significant underestimate factor. That's the best data we have, which is self-report. What about our youth? And I'll get to in a minute on why we need to pay particular attention to youth and cannabis. Again, reporting on last use of cannabis at least once in the last year. You can see by province, different provinces there. It is around 19% as the Canadian average, which is significantly, of significant interest is to make the fact that we now have youth smoking rates are down. The national average is around 11%. So we have significantly higher use of cannabis by youth in this country than we do of tobacco. So I think the point is there, we need to look at what have we done successfully in tobacco that we can use with cannabis. And again, the highest rates of past year use of cannabis in youth, or you can see the two provinces there are New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Not necessarily a distinction where we want to continue. So that's some of the epidemiology. What about the health impacts of cannabis? I will start by saying that we do know that one of the arguments around why we should legalize cannabis is that it is less risky from a health perspective than two legal drugs we currently have, tobacco and alcohol. While that is true, we've got to be very careful about how we say that. It doesn't mean that cannabis does not have risks with it. So while in general it is less risky, it doesn't mean it's a safe drug. And from a public health perspective, while legalization has lots of benefits, we have to be very careful that how we frame this is about the purpose of legalization. The objective would be its use, and I'll come back to that because there are ways we can do that. So what are the risks of cannabis? And the risks are mostly related to regular, frequent, if not daily use. Certainly there is an increased risk of psychosis. There's certainly a relationship between other psychiatric disorders as well. We know that there is about 9% of regular users meet criteria for a cannabis dependency, cannabis use disorder. We also know that the vast majority of cannabis, as well as we can estimate that's used, is actually used by people who are heavy regular users. As you can see, the stat there is that only 5%, estimated only 5% of the cannabis used in Canada is by adults who use it on a periodic basis. So what that is that it's heavy regular users who are using the vast majority of cannabis, and that's the issue we really need to be dealing with. As we mentioned earlier this morning, as some states now are starting to legalize various forms of cannabis, there's an emerging issue around child poisoning that we have to pay attention to, around different forms, edible products and flavored products. Clearly, there's an increase in accidental poisonings and overdoses young children admitted to emergency rooms. Of particular interest is the impact upon the developing brain. like with other psychoactive substances, tobacco, alcohol, other illicit drugs, we know that there is a particular impact on youth and young adults because use of substances like cannabis during that period, our brain doesn't fully develop until about age 23. So we know that use of cannabis, especially regular, heavy use of cannabis in youth and young adults when that brain is developing has much greater risks than use of cannabis by somebody who's older, an adult when the brain is developed. And that heavy regular use of cannabis during youth and young adults can cause permanent physiologic and structural changes in the brain, and people are at increased risk of long-term effects because some of those changes may not be reversible. So again, I think we need to be really particularly focusing on youth and young adults as we move down this road of changing the legal framework around cannabis. We have to be very particular, be careful to protect youth in many ways. What about lung health, because this is a product that's smoked. The studies are mixed, and it may be that we just haven't done enough research yet, but there's no clear evidence showing cannabis use as an increased risk of lung cancer or chronic lung disease at this point in time. Part of the problem is that many people who smoke cannabis are also smokers, and there certainly is a practice of mixing tobacco and cannabis together in a single smokable cigarette, so it makes it complicated to study. There certainly is, and most particular for today, from your world, is a particular issue around impaired driving. I'm just going to give you a quote from, I don't know how many people saw, the World Health Organization in the last couple of months released a report, The Health and Social Effects of Non-Medical Cannabis Use. Even though the effect is small compared to the effects of alcohol, traffic injury may be the most important adverse public health outcome for cannabis in terms of mortality in high and middle-income countries. In other words, you're absolutely right to be targeting drug-impaired driving and cannabis-impaired driving is a substantive issue and maybe one of the most important negative consequences that can happen from cannabis use, and one that needs particular attention as we move down the road of changing the regulatory framework around cannabis. So again, there are many potential health risks from cannabis that we need to be aware of, and the last thing we want to do is to increase those health risks as we change the legal framework around cannabis. However, there are also other impacts from cannabis. So our current approach of cannabis being an illegal drug creates significant social and individual harms. People involved in the criminal justice system, disruption of communities and families and what that does, and especially a disproportionate burden of that legal impacts and then the social impacts that are created from that falls upon marginalized and racialized populations. Here in Canada, often our First Nations communities, other impacted communities, for instance here in Nova Scotia, African Nova Scotians. We certainly know in the United States the impact of cannabis being illegal on African American communities as well. So not insignificant as one of the driving factors behind changing the legal framework around cannabis. There is also impacts from, especially youth, heavy regular use of cannabis around educational attainment, employment. Those are often confounded with people with those individuals often come from adverse experiences in their early childhood years, living in marginalized situations already. So it's not purely just the cannabis, but certainly we know that heavy regular use of cannabis, it's particularly a problem in young youth and young adult males, where this impairment of their potential in life through impacts on employment and education, it can be quite profound. So, this slide is really about a general framework. So what you can see on that slide is that, and this applies to any psychoactive substance, whether they're legal. So on the right-hand side, we would have a legal product. Somewhere along the right-hand side of that U going up is tobacco and alcohol. And on the other side, the unregulated black market is currently all illegal drugs, cannabis, opioids, cocaine, etc. What we do know is that both extremes, whether unregulated, illegal, or illegal, they're both driven by profit motive. And so you're going to get huge, that's where you're going to get maximum use and maximum harms, because you have two industries, one legal, one illegal, who are driving the use and consumption of these products. So when we know where we are with cannabis today, we're on that illegal, on that left-hand side of the U. Make no mistake about it, there is no lack of access to cannabis by anyone in Canada. And the products are becoming more, higher and higher potency, and we complicated it by introducing medical marijuana. And that's a whole other issue that is, hopefully the legalization approach will clear that up. There really is very few, to make a bit of an aside, there's very few medical conditions where there's any evidence that cannabis is actually therapeutic. And certainly in my conversations with family physicians, that what they're seeing is that for most people, it's young adults who are looking for some justification of an already existing heavy use of cannabis. So we've created a lot of issues with our medical marijuana model that hopefully will clear up. For all the products that we have, where you get the bottom of the U, so where we get the minimum use, and therefore the minimum harms, not naive, is we're never getting any of these products, we'll never get to zero. But where you get the minimum use and the minimum harms is where you have a strong regulatory framework, where it's a legal product with very strict government control on the production, distribution, sale. That is where we need to be going, we need to be focused with cannabis from a public health perspective. So what we have right now is we have some tension where we have medical marijuana, somehow this so-called legal medical marijuana, there's an industry being created around that. There's significant pressure of lots of people just waiting for the government to make final decisions and for them to make lots of money off the production and sale of marijuana. So from a public health perspective, we have to really hope that our elected officials are able to withstand those pressures to not move from the left-hand side to start to go up the right-hand side of the U, where we put the product now legal in the hands of private industry, who will be driven singly and primarily from a financial perspective. We need to have this in the tight control of governments, and we need to have governments themselves that don't see this primarily as a way to generate revenue for governments. There will be a revenue stream here, but our objective needs to be, first and foremost, public health objectives, to protect youth and to decrease the use and decrease the harms from cannabis. And that's the position many of us, and myself and my colleagues in public health, are putting forward in a process now that the federal government is starting to unfold and engaging provinces and territories around what's the regulatory framework we place around cannabis. So what would that look like from a public health perspective? We'd have significant regulations around the product, who actually gets to grow and distribute cannabis. That would be, I can't get into the details, but we have to make sure that there's explicit legal approaches around that. There has to be controls over the potency, so we need to have restrictions on the content of THC within products. We're going to be very careful. Cannabis is even more complicated than alcohol and cigarettes because it's smokable, it's in oils, it's in products that can go into vaping devices, it's in edibles. So we're going to have to cover all those different types of formulations when we deal with a regulated approach, ensuring that we don't make the mistakes that we've done in tobacco and allowed child-oriented products, flavored products, etc., even candies, cannabis-containing candies. We're going to have to make sure those are controlled and preventing an industry from producing those that are oriented to children. We have an opportunity now in front of us where we've had to play, we're all continue to play catch up and try to predict where the tobacco industry is going to go next and then control their product. We actually now, as we create a new legal framework with a new product, not new, but a legal framework around this product, we actually have a chance to do things proactively and prevent the industry from doing things like flavoring that we then have to try to clean up afterwards. The second important point is around access. So we need to control sales to minors. So it should be like alcohol and cigarettes, it should be illegal for sale to minors. From a public health perspective, there's going to be lots of disagreement on this, but from a public health perspective, we need to have government-owned cannabis stores. It shouldn't be sold with alcohol. That's just asking for trouble. It shouldn't, from my perspective, from a public health perspective, shouldn't be given to pharmacists to sell either. We need to have tight control over the sale of this directly by government, and then we need to have limits on the number and the density of outlets and then where they're located, for instance, in relation to schools, and then controls on the hours and days of sale. All that is about access. So how do we make sure we have control of access? Pricing, we know with alcohol and tobacco that pricing is one of the key levers that we have in terms of protecting youth especially and decreasing use. So certainly if there's different potencies of products, the more potent the product, the more expensive it needs to be. And we need to make sure that taxation is used as a way to limit use and also preventing sales and discounts on products. Marketing. We almost have virtually no tobacco marketing now. And one of the huge problems we have around alcohol is an industry that markets heavily. So again, we can get out of the gate with cannabis, doing things right, doing things correctly, by having significant restrictions, if not almost virtually no marketing of cannabis, including sponsorship of all those other pieces. And we also need the public awareness, counter-marketing that we do, certainly specific impaired driving laws. You're going to hear more details about this from the rest of the panel, that we need to have absolutely be stronger on detecting and penalties on cannabis impaired driving. And we need to ensure that we protect the public and workers, that we include the use of cannabis in our places that are currently smoke-free and vaping-free. So I'll end up by saying that is really the impaired driving piece, but while we need specific work on cannabis impaired driving, what I would suggest is that the public health framework that I've put to you needs to be adopted if we're going to actually, that's where we're actually going to have the impact upon minimizing cannabis impaired driving, is combining cannabis impaired